Thank you for joining us for this program for Nutrition Month by Alberta Health Services and 3 dietetic interns from the University of Alberta who are completing their practicum with Alberta Health Services in Red Deer. We have Joanna Lowe, Annika Krisen, Dina Levasseur, and they will be speaking to us today about unlocking the potential of food ingredients for a healthier tomorrow. So I'd like to turn the screen to Annika to begin the program.
Perfect. Thank you, Kim.
All right. So hello and welcome to the Nutrition Month 2022 Central Zone presentation. So as we were introduced, my name is Dina and I'm here with Joanna and Annika to give this presentation today. To start, we have a quick disclaimer. This material is intended for general information only and is provided on an as-is, where-is basis. So as was stated, the theme of Nutrition Month 2022 is Unlock the Potential of Food, Ingredients for a Healthier Tomorrow. This year, we want to focus on how we can get the most out of our food while considering our environmental impact. We are encouraging Albertans to think about ways to maximize their food and minimize waste. This is the Nutrition Month calendar for 2022, which includes our 5 key themes for the 5 weeks of March, as well as challenges every day to help you get the most out of your food and reduce your environmental impact. You can scan the QR code in the bottom right corner to find this calendar and try some of the challenges out for yourself. The key messages for Nutrition Month 2022 include rethinking your purchases, reducing food waste, reusing and repurposing, regrowing your food, and reconnecting with the land. I'll now let Joanna tell you about how you can rethink your purchases.
So our first key message for Nutrition Month is to rethink your purchases. During the first week of March, think about planning your meals that you want to make for any given day of the week, making a list before, and being smart when going grocery shopping. Also, make sure to know what you have at home before buying unnecessary ingredients. So plan your meals. Come up with a few ideas or recipes that you would like to make for the week. Our first tip is to consider your schedule. So don't plan on making an elaborate meal on a night that you already have errands to run or appointments to attend. This is where having a whiteboard calendar, planner, or agenda in your kitchen or on your fridge will really be a lifesaver. Setting some time aside on a Sunday, for example, to go grocery shopping and to do meal prep could save you a lot of time during the week when there's always a million other things to get done. Our second tip is to be flexible. You don't need to plan out every meal and snack for the week. Start by planning maybe 3 to 4 meals in a week and then see how it goes. Starting small is always better than not starting at all. You can even take your kids and other family members grocery shopping and have them come up with some ideas of what they would like to have for dinner in one night of the week. You may also have leftovers from bigger meals that you made earlier in the week, and this is where only planning those few meals and being flexible comes in really handy. So be creative and see how you can use or make those unexpected leftovers into a different meal using only what you have stocked in the house. The next thing you want to consider are servings and portion sizes. So while you're doing that meal planning, you might want to consider asking yourself the following questions. How many people plan on eating? What is their usual appetite? And how many servings will the recipe provide? An easy way of getting a recipe, for example, to feed more people is to add more filler ingredients. So think simple and uncomplicated. Filler ingredients can be anything you have in your pantry on a day-to-day basis. For example, adding a filler ingredient such as lentils to your ground beef mixture when making lasagna will not only get you more protein and fiber, but it also makes those portions a lot more filling. Similarly, adding things like potatoes, carrots, peas, and frozen spinach or kale to stews are another great way to bulk up a recipe. So make a greater volume of food by simply adding a few additional inexpensive ingredients. as well as incorporating some more vegetables into your day. Our fourth tip is to always look in the fridge first. So plan your meals for the next week using what you have on hand before buying other ingredients. Get the most out of your food by implementing the first in, first out method. This method involves moving older foods to the front of your fridge, freezer, and pantry and placing those newer items in the back. And this will ensure that older products are used first and reduce the chance of you using a newer product while an older one reaches its best before or expiration date. Dina will talk a little bit more about easy ways you can implement the first in, first out method later in this presentation as well. And moving on to our fifth tip, it is to use kind of those fresh foods first. So using fresh vegetables and fruit earlier in the week will prevent them from going bad. And you can always use frozen and canned vegetables and fruit later in the week when you run out of that fresh produce. Keeping fruits and vegetables in the right places in the fridge will also keep them fresh for longer. And this will also be discussed a little later in the presentation in more detail as well. So next, we want to think double duty. So ask yourself the question, what other recipes could I use this food item in? And try and come up with 2 or 3 meals that you can make using that ingredient. So buying those multi-purpose ingredients like canned beans that can be used in chili, soup, and tacos will not only save you time when planning out meals, it will also allow you to use up those ingredients that you may have sitting in your pantry and that you may not have thought to use otherwise. Thinking double duty is also a whole lot easier when you have versatile ingredients in your pantry and fridge. So having those basic multi-purpose ingredients on hand at all times could save you a lot of headache in the week. Bring life to leftovers when you are feeling uninspired by adding a few extra ingredients that you already have at home. For example, do you have leftover mac and cheese but aren't quite in the mood for eating it 2 times in a row? You might want to consider mixing it with some sauteed onion, garlic, an egg, or some flour, and some Thai sweet chili sauce, and baking or frying the mixture to make those into mac and cheese balls or cups. Alternatively, you can freeze leftovers in individual portions for whenever you're not in the mood to cook, or just simply round out of the time to make something for lunch or supper. Our final tip for when you're doing your meal planning is to start at the beginning and bring it back to the basics. So make your go-to meals first and then gradually try to incorporate a few new recipes each week. Planning meals for the week doesn't mean you have to make exquisite meals or follow a meal plan. Just having a general idea of what you would like to eat in the coming week is a great starting point. When planning out meals, try to have a grain, protein, and vegetable and/or fruit at all meals as well. And in doing this, your meals will not only be more colorful, but they will also keep you full for longer and give your body the variety of nutrients it needs for your overall health. So next, make a list. It sounds simple, right? It will definitely save you some time and thinking in the grocery store as well as money. Instead of trying to remember, for example, if the tomatoes you bought last week are still fresh, if you even have any left over in the house as well. So our first tip for this is to take stock before you shop. So checking your fridge, pantry, and freezer before going grocery shopping will keep you from buying unnecessary ingredients that you probably already have at home. So while you're checking what you have at home, try to think about meals you could make out of those ingredients that you have on hand already. You may already have everything you need for a recipe without even realizing it. And also, if you find that you're missing one ingredient in a recipe, for example, try and think if there isn't something you already have on hand that you can kind of use in its place. So by following these 3 easy and simple steps, you might find that you don't even have to pay a visit to the grocery store at all. Secondly, keep a list and pen to go along with it on hand at all times. Having a notepad readily available for whenever something in your pantry or fridge runs out will make your life a whole lot easier when trying to plan meals for the week. put the list somewhere you can see it as well. You may want to consider placing it on the fridge or pantry door for easy access, and stick to the list and bring it along when you go grocery shopping so you don't buy those things you don't have a plan for. The next topic is reducing food waste, so I will turn it back over to Dina.
All right. So within the key message of reducing food waste, we'll cover how to store your food to make it last longer, ways to ensure you're using up your food so it's not going to waste, and tips to reduce your food waste at meal times. So to start, storing your food to make it last. Perfect. The first tip to storing your food to make it last is to make sure you're keeping perishable foods cool. You will want to have your fridge set to 0 to 4 degrees Celsius and your freezer set to at least -18 degrees Celsius or lower to ensure that food remains fresh and does not spoil too quickly. If you do not have a thermometer built into your refrigerator, you can purchase one online or at a local retailer. Ensure you're placing your fridge thermometer on a shelf in your fridge and not in the door of the fridge, as the door is often warmer than the rest of your fridge. After preparing a meal or snack, ensure you are refrigerating or freezing your leftovers within 2 hours. Leaving leftovers out at room temperature for longer than 2 hours can increase the risk of food spoilage and food safety concerns. Foods that are refrigerated should be eaten within 3 days, and food stored in the freezer should be eaten within 3 months. Store meat near the bottom of your refrigerator in the original containers. If the original container is not leak-proof, consider placing it in an additional bowl or container to prevent any liquids from getting on other items in your fridge. Meat should never be defrosted at room temperature, such as on the counter, as this keeps the meat in the danger zone, which is between 4 to 60 degrees Celsius, for an extended period of time and allows for harmful bacteria growth and spoilage. The safest way to thaw frozen meat is to place the product in the refrigerator to thaw overnight. If you're using this method, it is recommended that you cook the item within 2 to 5 days of thawing, depending on the type of meat. Poultry, ground meat, and seafood should be used within 2 days, whereas products such as steak, pork chops, or roasts can be used within 3 to 5 days. With our busy lives, it can be easy to forget to defrost your meat the night before. Therefore, if this happens to you, the second safest option for thawing is to place your meat in a sealed bag and submerge it in cold water, which should be changed about every 30 minutes. Using this method will take between 1 to 3 hours for standard cuts of meat to thaw. If it's approaching dinner time and you don't have time to defrost your meat using the cold water method, you may choose to use the microwave for your meat products to defrost them. If you choose this method, you should cook your meat product immediately after thawing. Do not wait to cook the product, and do not refreeze the product after microwaving. Some fruits and vegetables continue to ripen after they have been picked, such as grapes, mushrooms, and stone fruits like peaches and avocados. These should be stored in the low humidity crisper drawer. Some fruits and vegetables do not continue to ripen and will therefore wilt more quickly. These items, such as leafy greens, carrots, and broccoli, should be stored in the high humidity crisper drawer. Our next tip to ensuring you're storing your foods to last is keeping it clear. This means storing your food in clear containers to keep track of what you have. You can also use a piece of tape or washable markers to label what date the food was prepared. That way you can ensure you use up your older leftovers first. Our third tip to ensure you are storing your food to make it last is implementing the first in, first out method in your kitchen, as explained earlier in the presentation, to reduce the chance of using a new product while an older product expires. Keeping the food out of the door for most refrigerators will also help to ensure your product stays fresher for longer. As I said, the door is usually the warmest part of your fridge. So items such as milk, yogurt, cheese, and meat products should be kept out of the door to help prevent spoilage and keep your items fresher for longer. Use the door of your refrigerator for long-lasting items like ketchup, mustard, jams, etc. Lastly, some final tips to storing your food to make it last longer includes keeping a magnetic whiteboard on your deep freezer to keep track of what is at the bottom of your freezer. That first in, first out method should also be implemented for your deep freezer. If you notice you have items such as meat, milk, bread, fruits, or vegetables that you don't think you'll use up before they spoil, you can freeze them and defrost them when needed. With fruits and vegetables, try freezing them in a single layer on baking sheets first, and then transferring them into an airtight container or bag to prevent the pieces from freezing together. Some vegetables should also be blanched before freezing, which Annika will talk about later in the presentation. The next topic we will cover to help reduce food waste is using it up. Wilted vegetables often get thrown out prematurely. However, we encourage you not to give up on your wilted vegetables. One way to bring life back to those wilted vegetables is to fill your sink or a large container with ice water. Soak the vegetables for 5 to 10 minutes, and you might find lettuce will crunch, bendy carrots will straighten, and saggy broccoli will find its strength. If vegetables are beyond the point of reviving, they can still be used in dishes such as stir fries or stews. To prevent premature browning and wilting, avoid slicing your foods until you're ready to use them. If you like chopped vegetables for easy meal preparation and snacking, try storing them in water to preserve freshness. A small amount of lemon or lime juice or a pinch of salt can also be added to cut up fruits or vegetables to prevent browning and prolong freshness. Lemon or lime juice can be added directly to the produce, and when using the salt method, try soaking your cut up produce in cold salt water. Drain, dry with a paper towel, and store in an airtight container in your fridge. The last topic we will cover to help reduce food waste is reducing food waste at mealtimes. Involving children and other family members in menu planning, grocery shopping, and meal preparation can help ensure that meals prepared include something everyone will enjoy. This can also help to get children more excited for mealtimes. Serving smaller portions or serving meals family style can help prevent extra food from going to waste. If serving family style, children should be monitored initially until they learn what is a good portion for them. Start with a small portion and take more if you're still hungry. Saving leftovers or making enough food for 2 meals instead of 1 can help reduce food waste as well as cooking time. Leftovers can be an easy lunch option or be stored in the freezer for an easy meal another time. Ensuring snack times are not too close to meal times can also help to ensure everyone's hungry at meal times and less food is wasted. A good rule of thumb is to try to limit snacking 2 to 3 hours before a mealtime. I will now hand it back to Joanna to talk about reusing and repurposing.
So as Dina mentioned, the third key message for Nutrition Month centers around reusing and repurposing. So whether this is reusing a takeout container to pack your lunch in, or soaking a banana peels in your water to use for watering your plants, every little bit helps to lessen waste and keep your garbage bin emptier for longer. So reuse containers seems like a simple task, right? Yet, due to the immediate convenience of discardable plastic bags and containers, we often opt for those instead. However, when you give it some further thought, reusable containers are even more convenient and cheaper in the long run. Choosing reusable doesn't have to be hard either. So keep a few reusable shopping bags in the trunk of your car so you have them readily available for whenever you need them, instead of a plastic bag ripping on the way to your car with all your groceries spilling onto the pavement. So let's just avoid that whole fiasco altogether and just keep a few reusable shopping bags in the trunks of our cars. You can even take it a step further and get a reusable water bottle. It's another must-have when trying to lessen waste. And then having a reusable water bottle is also handy because it can help serve as a daily reminder to drink more water. So why not get a reusable one that lasts longer anyways? Better yet, you can even reuse glass bottles that once held lemonade or juice and redecorate them using acrylic paint. They will be convenient, durable, and nice looking. Having a Pinterest-worthy pantry and/or fridge with matching food storage and prep containers is great, but simply making the most of what you have already, food and food storage-wise, is what makes all the difference in the end. After all, we are all just looking to minimize waste and maximize what we already have on hand, be it food, takeout containers, or glass jars previously used to store other items. You can even try using beeswax paper instead of plastic wrap next time you are wrapping your sandwich for lunch. So rethink your food scraps. When you start seeing those scraps as merely as ingredients that can be repurposed in other areas of your day-to-day living, you will find your perspective of what food waste or using the odds and ends of ingredients change. So make the most out of your scraps. Before throwing out your leftover coffee grounds, add some to the soil of your plants to keep insects away, or mix them with water and or an oil of your choosing, like bio oil or melted coconut oil, for example, and use them as a natural skin exfoliator. Don't throw out your leftover eggshells either. They can be ground up and added to baking recipes for extra calcium. To do this, you will first need to boil them in water for 2 minutes. And after boiling your shells, you can transfer them to a baking sheet and bake them at 225 degrees Fahrenheit for 45 to 50 minutes, or until they're completely dried out. And then once they're dried out, you want to blend them into a powder using a blender, coffee, or spice grinder. So next time you're making your favorite muffin recipe, add some eggshell powder to the batter, pour, portion, and bake your muffins like you would usually, and tell me that you can't feel your bones getting stronger. Think twice, your food scraps might suffice. Trying to eat more vegetables on the daily? Try baking potato and carrot peels into chips to snack on between meals. It's as easy as lining a baking pan with parchment paper, quickly drizzling some canola or olive oil over your leftover peels, maybe adding some seasoning of your choosing, and baking them at 425 degrees Fahrenheit for 30 minutes or until you have that desired crispiness. Fall is also known as being squash season, so next time you're carving out that pumpkin for Halloween or making butternut squash soup, set the seeds aside and bake them for a pre-meal snack instead of immediately tossing them in the garbage bin. You can even add some extra flavor to your pasta dishes by mixing some pasta water into the sauce. You can even take it a step further and flavor your pasta while it's cooking with herbs such as basil, oregano, onion, or garlic salt. You can even use your leftover pasta water to make broth, or use that water in bread recipes when you need to add water. Believe me, once you try these, you will never go back. In need of some green around the house, put that sweet potato that you have lying around the house or leftover avocado seed from some recently made guacamole to good use by letting them soak in water until they sprout and then planting them in soil. You will have self-made houseplants in no time. But it is a daunting task sometimes to know what to or even where to start when trying to make the most out of your food scraps. So just to get your thoughts rolling, you may want to consider flipping through a few cookbooks for inspiration, or consulting with a friend or family member to hear what they might already be doing to reduce their carbon footprint. There are countless books available in store and online about repurposing food waste and living a less wasteful life. Feel free to peruse the internet or a nearby bookstore and try to find one that fits your needs. But I will turn it over to Annika, who's going to talk about regrowing your food.
Thanks, Joanna. Now we'll talk about our final 2 key messages for the presentation. The 4th key message is regrow your food. This section will cover regrowing your produce scraps, sourdough sustainability and how to make the most of your sourdough, and then we'll talk about the whys and how-tos of composting. All right, so what we mean by regrowing your food scraps is instead of throwing away, for example, the bottom of a green onion where the roots usually grow, you can take that bottom piece of green onion that you might usually be throwing away and regrow new green onions from it. It's almost just that easy. I'll explain in a few slides. There are a few vegetables that only require water to initiate new growth. Beet and carrot tops are an example of this. To grow greens from your vegetables, here are a few simple steps to follow. First, you'll want to wash your vegetable well before cutting into it and remove the stem and leaves, which you can use in another recipe. Then separate the main part of the vegetable from the top of the vegetable. The top part here is where new leaves will grow from. Then you'll want to place the vegetable top in a dish, for example, a shallow bowl, and add just enough water to the dish so that the water covers the top of the vegetable. Because plants need sunlight to grow, keep your little plant in a sunny spot. You'll want to change the water every 1 to 2 days and keep the water level consistent with the top curve of the vegetable. Then wait a couple of days and you'll see new leaves begin to form. In just a week or so, you'll have carrot or beet greens to cut, and then you can use them in salads, fry them, or simply just saute them. Ginger root and various kinds of potatoes are examples of foods that only need to be planted in some soil for regrowth. Let's take a look at the simple process of regrowing potatoes. Before you plant, you'll want to make sure that the potatoes have eyes, which are small bumps or divots where sprouts will eventually grow from. If sprouts have not grown from your potato yet, place the potato in a cool, dark place for about 2 weeks to allow for sprouting. This could be, for example, in a cabinet close to the ground. Once you have sprouts growing, you're ready to plant. Small potatoes can be planted directly into soil, but for larger potatoes, try cutting them in half and make sure that each piece has at least 2 sprouts growing. You'll want to make sure that the potatoes feel dry to touch, and then you can plant them in soil 2 to 3 inches deep, outside or inside in a large container with sun exposure. In terms of watering your growing potatoes, you actually don't need to water the potatoes until they start to sprout above the soil. And I won't review the process for ginger root or sweet potato here, but they do follow a process very similar to that of potatoes. So other scraps do best with an initial water treatment, and then they can be transferred to soil. Lettuce, celery, leeks, and herbs are just a few examples of foods that can be regrown by placing the stem in some water, and then once roots or new leaves start to grow, they can be transferred to soil. You can keep these plants either inside or outside as long as they have sunlight and water. Lettuce and celery will need to be watered daily, while leeks and herbs can be watered 1 to 2 times a week. All right, so I've explained the how of regrowing your food scraps, but what about the why? What are the benefits here? First off, growing your own produce from home is environmentally friendly. If you use your own regrown products, then it reduces the amount of items that you're purchasing from the store which have undergone packaging and shipping. You'll also reduce the amount of waste going to the landfill by using foods that you may otherwise be throwing away. Second, it saves money. Produce is expensive, especially herbs, so by growing your own, you can save on your grocery bill. Third, when we grow our own foods, we foster a relationship both with the food we eat and with the land. Fourth, regrowing your food requires minimal equipment and space, meaning that you don't need a full backyard garden or to invest many resources to harvest your own grown produce. And finally, what's more accessible than growing food right at your home? You'll have some of your favorite herbs and salad components right at your fingertips. Another item that you can grow in your home, especially if you were bitten by the pandemic-induced sourdough bug, is Sourdough Starter. If you've made a sourdough starter before, you're likely familiar with the term sourdough starter discard. Sourdough baking can unfortunately lead to a lot of waste, as feeding the starter requires discarding most of it and then refeeding the starter with flour and water. So here we'll review the steps to making your own sourdough starter, as well as ways to repurpose that discard. Although making a sourdough may seem like a big task or like it's only for those who are baking enthusiasts, a lot of the steps are repetitive and very, very similar. So for making a sourdough starter, here's what you'll need. A large mason jar. The glass size here can vary, but for the amount shared in this presentation, you'll want a mason jar that holds up to 4 cups. You'll want a weigh scale, which isn't necessary, but it can be helpful in making sure that your measurements are precise. A thermometer is also here on the list, and it isn't necessary also, but it can be helpful to make sure that your starter is growing in an optimal temperature, which is between 22 and 30 degrees Celsius, so a little bit above room temperature. And then last on the list here are flour and water, which are the only 2 ingredients that you actually need to make a sourdough starter. Now we'll go into the steps, which are split into 6 days. So on day 1, you'll want to measure the flour and water. For this recipe, 120 grams of flour and 120 grams of water are used, but you can use smaller ratios if you want a smaller starter. If you're not using a scale, this 120 grams would equal about 1 cup of flour and half a cup of water. Mix the water and flour in a jar until the flour is all incorporated. The mixture here will be thick like toothpaste or peanut butter, but this is okay because once the starter begins to metabolize that flour, it'll turn pretty runny. Then you'll want to place a cover on the glass jar or place a damp cloth on it and allow this mixture to sit in a warm, draft-free area or on the counter for 48 hours. So then moving on to day 2, which will be 48 hours later, you should see some bubbling in the starter, which is a sign of activity. If you don't see bubbling, allow the starter to sit for another 12 hours and then check it again. Once you do see bubbles, discard all but half a cup of the starter, and the remaining amount in the jar is now called your sourdough starter discard. But make sure that you don't throw away this discard. You can save it in a container in the fridge for later use, and we'll go over a few examples of what to do with this in a few slides. Then you'll feed that half a cup of starter that you measured with 1 cup of flour and half a cup of water. You'll mix them until fully incorporated again, and then place a lid loosely on the top and allow it to sit at room temperature or in that warm environment for another 24 hours. Then going on to day 3. So after 24 hours, again, you should be able to see some more bubbles in the starter. And another great sign of activity here would be if you see slide marks along the jar, which indicates that the starter has risen and then fallen again. If your starter is rising and falling, this means that it's active and metabolizing the flour that you're feeding it. It also means that the starter is hungry and it's ready for another feeding. Once you see these signs of activity and hunger, you can discard all but half again and then feed the half a cup starter with 1 cup of flour and half a cup of water. Then again, allow it to sit for 12 to 24 hours. All right, so now it's day 4. After 12 hours, check for signs of activity. If your starter looks active and hungry, you can discard and then feed the starter following the same steps as in day 2 and 3. If you don't see signs of activity yet, wait another 12 hours. So at this point, you may be feeding your starter every 24 hours, every 12 hours, or maybe even every 6 hours in warmer environments. Your starter activity really does depend on the temperature of your home and even on the water and the flour that you're using. Once you feed it, allow it to sit for another 6 to 24 hours. And if by day 5, your starter is at a point where it's doubling in size consistently between feedings, then you're likely able to use it for baking a sourdough bread. If it doesn't double in size between feedings by day 5, just keep feeding it and follow the same process. It'll get there. So my last day here is day 6, but your last day will be as long as it takes to see that consistent rise and fall in your starter. Once you see this, then your starter is ready for one final feeding. For this final feeding, discard all but 1/3 of the cup and then add 1 cup of flour and your half a cup of water. And after this, your starter should double in size within 4 to 6 hours. Once you're at this point and it does double in size within 4 to 6 hours, your starter is ready to bake with. All right, so now I'll play a video that reviews the steps of making a sourdough from the initial phases all the way to making a sourdough bread. Welcome to this quick tutorial on making a sourdough starter. The first step is to measure out 125 grams of flour and 125 grams of water, which works out to be about a heaping cup of flour and half a cup of water. I used whole wheat flour here to offer more nutrients in the first feeding, but you can use any type of flour that you like. Then you'll mix all the ingredients together and place a cap on and leave it for 48 hours. After 48 hours, pour out about half a cup of the starter. The remaining amount in the jar is considered discard. What I did with the discard is I added it to a bowl and kept it in the fridge to use in other recipes such as brownies or pizza crust. Then take the half a cup of sourdough starter that you used and add 125 grams of water and 125 grams of flour. So this is called feeding the starter, and what you're doing is you're giving it food to grow and metabolize. Continue to mix the flour until it's fully incorporated, and then add the dough into a clean mason jar. All I did was clean my old one out, and the reason for wanting a clean one is so that you're able to see slide marks on the jar, which indicate that your starter is rising and falling, and this is a good sign of a healthy starter. So then you will just ensure everything's incorporated and set a cap on lightly and leave it for 24 more hours. 24 hours after the second feeding, you can see that there are slide marks along the mason jar, which indicates that the starter has risen and fallen again. And these are signs of a healthy starter that is metabolizing the flour that you're feeding it. So what I'll do here now is save half a cup of the starter and I'll discard the rest and save it for other recipes. You'll take that initial starter that you're saving, the half a cup, and add it to a bowl where you will then proceed to feed it again. So giving it that 125 grams of flour and 125 grams of water, and then mix until well incorporated. Once I fed my starter, I'm going to add it back into that clean mason jar again. And what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to add an elastic to the mason jar at the height of the starter when I first add it into the mason jar. And this is completely optional, but what it can do is give you a measurement of how much your starter is falling and rising if you compare it to that mark on the mason jar where the elastic is. Then all I'll do is set a cap on it and leave it to rest for 12 hours. After 12 hours, I didn't see much activity, so I ended up waiting until 24 hours to feed it again. I didn't see any rising and falling action, but I did see a few bubbles, so I decided to pour out my half a cup and feed it with the 125 grams of flour and 125 grams of water. Many factors can influence the activity of your starter, such as the flour you're using, the water, and the temperature of your home. So again, once you feed your starter, you will add it to the mason jar and then allow it to sit for about 12 hours. At this point, by day 4, you should be seeing a consistent rise and fall in your starter where it peaks at about 6 or 8 hours and then begins to fall in height. Afterwards, here I wasn't seeing that consistent rise and fall every 12 hours that we do want to see, but I was still checking in every 24 hours to see if there were any signs of activity. So I will fast forward to the next few days of checking the starter every 24 hours and feeding it as long as I did see at least a few bubbles. Starters can take anywhere from 6 days to 2 weeks to mature. I had mine going for about 10 days before it was ready. An indication for a mature starter is if the starter is continuously rising and falling after feeding to the point where it is doubling in size at its peak. Once you have this, you're ready to make a sourdough bread. On day 10, my starter was at a point where it doubled in size within 6 hours, which is an indication that your starter has enough activity to be able to leaven a loaf of bread. A great way to verify if your starter is ready to leaven a loaf of bread is to perform the float test. So all you do is drop a small amount of your starter into a glass of water, and if the starter floats, then your starter is ready to use for baking. If it doesn't, all you'll want to do is continue feeding for a few more days until it successfully floats in water. To make my sourdough bread, I combined my fed starter with flour, salt, and water. There are many different recipes out there and the procedures do vary, so I won't explain my process today, but I will share with you the end product. Here is my little sourdough, and the recipes don't end here. There are so many recipes available which incorporate sourdough discard into the ingredients so that you don't have to throw away your discard. Some recipes that I've tried out that include sourdough discard include pizza crust, cinnamon buns, and brownies. And this is such a great way to get creative, but also reduce waste when you're making your sourdough. All right, so I hope that this video helped make more sense of the steps in making a starter and also inspired you to try making one at home. This was my first attempt at making a sourdough starter, and it wasn't without a few hiccups, but I do promise it's worth it. Also, if you make a sourdough, don't forget to name the sourdough starter. I named mine Stacy the Starter. All right, so if I had $1 for every time that I said discard in that video and in the steps that I explained, I would have a lot of change, and there would also be a lot of waste if you were to actually throw away that discard. Here are a few ideas to help minimize waste by reusing it in a few delicious recipes. So you can repurpose the discard to make a plethora of different options with a quick internet search. You'll find a ton of recipes to use your discard in so that it never needs to be discard again. For examples, pancakes or pretzels or pizza crust. You can also repurpose this discard to make a crunchy topping for salads, stir fries, or desserts, or even use it as a thickening agent for soups and sauces. Composting is our third topic in this section of regrowing your food. Although composting is not regrowing your food per se, we are taking scraps and turning them into something that is not waste. Composting is the process where bacteria and microbes break down organic matter, such as kitchen scraps, into a valuable fertilizer which can enrich soil. This valuable fertilizer is known as compost. So why compost? A big component of diverting foods from a landfill is the use of composting. On a chemical level, composting food waste is better for the environment than sending it to a landfill because discarded food that decays in landfills releases high amounts of methane, which is a greenhouse gas, and accelerates atmospheric warming. Compost also enriches soil and actually promotes higher yields of agricultural crops. The bacteria that break down materials to create compost use carbon and nitrogen and also require a moist but aerated environment. Therefore, there are 4 key components to a basic compost at home. The first is green material, which can come from vegetables, fruit, coffee grounds, and plant trimmings, and these produce nitrogen. The second ingredient here is brown material, which can come from napkins, newspaper, wood chips, hay, and leaves, and these produce the carbon for the compost. Third, the water will come from watering your compost pile. And then the fourth and final ingredient for compost is air, meaning that you don't want to completely cover your compost pile. So there are generally 2 ways that we can compost. The first is to compost at home, where the process of food to compost takes place in your backyard. There are simple and more complex methods for composting at home, and both will create nutrient-rich compost for your soil. Home composting doesn't allow for the same amount of heat to be created as in industrial composting, which we'll talk about in a minute, and therefore isn't sustainable for meat, fish, dairy, and compostable cutlery. The second option is to partake in a municipal composting program, and these do have a lower commitment because you don't need to care for a compost pile like you would in home composting. Municipal compost programs look different in different areas, so be sure to access resources that explain the do's, the don'ts, and the how-tos of your municipal compost program. All right, so the 5th and final key message for Nutrition Month 2022 is reconnect with the land. The topics covered in this final key message include the impact of agriculture, planting your own garden, container gardening, harvesting your garden, how to winterize plants, and connecting with local farmers. So let's dive into this last topic. First, we'll look at the impact of agriculture on the environment. So although we strongly encourage the consumption of fruits and vegetables, it's also important to be aware of the impact that the produce that we consume has on the environment. From mass-produced crops and agriculture occupying half of the world's habitable land to packaging and transportation, the dilemma and sustainability of our produce is of growing concern. The majority of produce that we buy at the store comes from mass-produced crops, which contribute to deforestation and also require a lot of water, where actually 70% of freshwater withdrawals globally are used for agriculture. These mass-produced crops also reduce our planet's biodiversity. Pesticides are also used on many produce. The problem with this is that runoff from areas treated with pesticides can pollute streams, ponds, lakes, and wells, which can harm plants and animals and contaminate groundwater. Third, transportation, packaging, and retail of the produce that we eat all require energy and resource inputs and further contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. So what can we do about this? Growing your own garden for produce is one way that we can decrease our environmental footprint and also connect more with the land and with our food. Gardening can actually begin in the winter months, where you can plant seeds or seedlings in your home and then transplant them outside when the weather is warmer. It's best to wait until there's no longer a risk of overnight frost when transplanting your garden outside or starting your outdoor garden. In most areas of Alberta, this is typically around the time of May long weekend. Common vegetables that can be started during the winter months are broccoli, Brussels sprouts, and cabbage. Because Alberta is not the most weather-forgiving province, not all vegetables and fruits grow well, but peas, beans, beets, tomato, and zucchini are common vegetables that do have success in Alberta. Fruits that do well are berries such as raspberries and Saskatoon berries, as well as rhubarb and apples. All right, so no garden space, not a problem. If you don't have space for gardening, getting connected with your community garden or greenhouse is a great alternative. You can find out if a community garden is close to you by contacting your local community centers, schools, or churches. If after some searching, you do determine that you don't have a community garden near you, you can even consider starting a community garden in your area. If this is something that interests you, Alberta Health Services has a resource to help you navigate starting a community garden. There is a QR code on the screen in the right corner that will bring you to this resource. Another option, if you have little or no garden space, is starting your own mini garden indoors. Some ideas of plants that grow well indoors are herbs, lettuce, green onion, tomatoes, hot peppers, potatoes, and carrots. You can start seeds in a small container, or you can even repurpose eggshells, an egg carton, or citrus rinds to start seeds in. Just add soil and then plant your seeds. Once they begin to grow, you'll want to transplant them either outside or into a larger container, such as a herb box, a yogurt container, or tin cans. With all of these, you'll want to also make sure that there's a hole at the bottom of this to allow for excess water to drain out. You'll also want to make sure that they have a sunny spot either inside or outside. Okay, so now let's talk about harvesting the garden, which is when you can literally enjoy the fruits of your labor. Most gardens are ready for harvest in the fall. There's quite a range for the timeline for harvesting, and this also depends on when you start your garden. Each plant has different lengths of time from seed to harvest, so it's important to consider this when planting your garden. You can also refer to farmers or other backyard gardeners in your region for what grows well and also times of harvest. The table on the slide shows the general harvesting timeline for some different fruits and vegetables that grow in Alberta. As you can see, there's quite a variation, but most are ready to be harvested between the months of July and October. Here are just a few ideas of what you can do with your harvested vegetable and fruit. Of course, you can eat anything from your garden fresh. There's nothing better than fresh picked fruits, veggies, and herbs. You can also use your harvest in all kinds of recipes. Zucchini muffins, a fresh salsa with tomatoes, or roasted veggies. There are so many options and so many great recipes out there. If you're freezing your veggies, you'll want to blanch them before, which means adding them to boiling water for 1 to 5 minutes, depending on the vegetable. Also consider the tip that Dina shared earlier. To prevent vegetables from sticking together in the freezer, freeze them first when they're spread out on a tray, and then once they're frozen, move them into a freezer bag or a tight box in the freezer for longer storage. For general storage, make sure that you keep your produce in a cool, dark place to maintain quality. You can also preserve your pickings by using some of the following methods. Apples and other fruits can be canned to make jellies, jams, and sauces. You can also dehydrate fruits and vegetables to make apple, beet, or carrot chips, or you can even dehydrate berries to add to granola or a yogurt parfait. Vegetables can also be fermented. Some common vegetables for fermenting are cabbage, carrots, cauliflower, garlic, peppers, and turnips. And pickling is another great option to get creative with. Cucumber, beets, and carrots are all great options for pickling. Keep in mind, though, if you are pickling or canning, be sure that you follow guidelines for canning and pickling, as the environment can harbor harmful organisms such as ones causing botulism. Health Canada is a really great resource to refer to when learning about safe canning methods. All right, so again, because we live in Alberta and it's not the most weather accommodating year round, here are some tips on preparing your gardens for the winter. Most foods and plants that you grow in your garden are annuals. This means that they complete their life cycle in one growing season, meaning that once you harvest them, they won't regrow back the following year. Therefore, when fall approaches and your plants are finished producing, you can cut them back and remove them from your garden. Perennials are plants that will grow back the following year, but in order to preserve the plant, you have to winterize it. Winterizing perennials does look different based on plant needs. Some plants might need to be kept inside or in a heated garage, and for these, you'll want to plant them in pots that can accommodate easy transport inside, and you'll also want growth lights and to water them regularly once they are inside over the winter. Other plants like raspberries can remain outside year-round and will grow back just fine the following year. Some herbs such as mint, garlic, and basil, as well as broccoli, asparagus, raspberries, strawberries, and grapes are considered to be perennials and will grow back the following year. Our last component of reconnecting with the land that we'll touch on today is connecting with sustainable food sources. Great ways to connect with sustainable food sources are supporting your local farmers markets, visiting farmers markets to connect with local farmers by collecting business cards, engaging in conversation and asking them questions, visiting restaurants that use locally grown and produced ingredients, and finally, since supermarkets are increasingly including locally sourced products, looking out for these is a really great option too. The Alberta government website has a link to a farmers market locator for all approved farmers markets in Alberta. Although it might not capture 100% of the markets near you, it can help you discover some new places to check out. There's a QR code that will take you to the map of the Alberta farmers markets in the bottom left corner here. And that is everything for today. Thank you so much for attending this presentation for Nutrition Month 2022. We hope that you learned about ways to maximize your food, minimize waste, and that you're inspired to get creative at home and in your communities.